Nobody stops on Highway 95 after midnight. But James Mitchell wasn't nobody. He was a kind taxi driver who saw a pregnant woman stumbling in the rain and couldn't drive past, even though the woman he was helping had just been abandoned by a husband who'd chosen his first love over their unborn child. Victoria Hartwell sat shivering in the back seat of that taxi, her whole world shattered, but she held one secret even her departing husband didn't know. She owned Hartwell Enterprises, the company that bore her maiden name, and Daniel had spent their entire marriage working for the wife he'd just thrown away. He'd wanted the promotion, the corner office, and the power that came with being close to the mysterious owner who never showed their face. But he'd never suspected that the quiet, supportive wife who encouraged his ambitions was the very person signing his paychecks. 3 weeks after that rainy night, when Daniel's mother Patricia stood before the board meeting, smugly announcing her son's appointment to acting CEO while mocking the desperate woman who couldn't keep her husband, the doors opened to reveal a figure no one expected. Would the abandoned pregnant wife finally reveal herself as the company's owner? How would Daniel explain abandoning his boss on a dark highway? What would his mother say when her public mockery became career suicide? And how would they react when the kind taxi driver who'd shown more integrity in one night than Daniel had shown in 5 years of marriage was introduced as the new chief operating officer, the position Daniel had been promised before he chose betrayal? Dear viewers, this powerful story will teach you why treating people with respect matters, even when you think they have no power over your future. You'll learn that your true character shows in how you act when no one important is watching, and that kindness always comes back to reward you, while cruelty destroys everything you've built. Watch how one choice on a rainy night changes 2 lives forever and proves that karma never forgets. What would you have done if you were Victoria? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring, entertaining, and life-changing stories that teach real values. The rest stops. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across Victoria Hartwell's face as she watched her husband load his suitcase into the trunk. But the coldness in Daniel's eyes hurt far more than the April rain soaking through her silk dress. She'd known this moment was coming for 3 weeks, ever since she'd discovered the text messages, the secret phone calls, the way he whispered Rebecca's name in his sleep, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the reality of watching the father of her unborn child choose someone else. "You can't be serious," Victoria said, her voice trembling as she pressed one hand against her swollen belly where their daughter kicked, as if sensing her mother's distress. "Daniel, I'm 7 months pregnant. You're really going to leave me here?" Daniel wouldn't meet her eyes, but his jaw tightened in that familiar way that meant he'd already made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. "Rebecca needs me, Victoria. She always has. I should never have married you. I was running from what I really felt, and that wasn't fair to either of us." He slammed the trunk closed with finality, and the sound echoed across the empty parking lot like a judge's gavel sealing her fate. "My mother always said you trapped me with this pregnancy, and maybe she was right." The words struck Victoria like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straighter, despite the way her legs shook beneath her. She'd built Hartwell Enterprises from nothing after her father's death 5 years ago, growing a struggling manufacturing firm into a billion-dollar empire while keeping her ownership completely anonymous, a decision her lawyer had recommended for security reasons, but one she'd maintained even after marriage, to test whether Daniel loved her or what she represented. Tonight she had her answer, but the truth tasted like poison in her mouth. "So that's it?" Victoria's voice cracked as she watched him round the car toward the driver's side, his movements quick and efficient, like he was late for an important meeting rather than abandoning his pregnant wife on a dark highway. 5 years of marriage and you're just gonna drive away? What am I supposed to do, Daniel? He paused with his hand on the door handle. but something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or the last gasp of the man she'd thought she married, before his expression hardened into cold resolve. "There's a motel 3 miles up the road. You've got your credit cards. Figure it out, Victoria. You're a smart woman. You'll land on your feet." He climbed into the car, started the engine, and added through the half-open window, "Rebecca and I are flying to Paris tomorrow morning. When I get back, we'll discuss divorce terms and custody arrangements. My lawyer will contact you." Victoria stood frozen in the rain as his taillights disappeared into the darkness, each second stretching into an eternity of disbelief that this was actually happening. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if demanding to know why her father had just driven away. But Victoria couldn't answer because she didn't understand it herself. She'd given Daniel everything he'd asked for: the beautiful home in Pacific Heights, the country club membership, the introduction to powerful business contacts, the recommendation that got him promoted to senior vice president at Sterling Corporation, which was actually Hartwell Enterprises' public-facing subsidiary, though Daniel didn't know she controlled it. She'd supported his career, boosted his confidence, and loved him with a devotion he apparently mistook for weakness. The rain fell harder as Victoria stumbled toward the highway, her designer heels sinking into the mud at the roadside, but she barely noticed the cold anymore because the numbness spreading through her chest had overtaken every other sensation. Cars passed without slowing, just blurs of headlights and the spray of puddle water, and she realized with dawning horror that nobody stopped on highways after midnight, that she was alone in a way she'd never experienced, despite growing up an only child in boarding schools while her father built his business empire. 3 miles to a motel might as well have been 300 in her condition, but Victoria forced herself to keep walking because the alternative was standing still, and standing still meant accepting that this was her new reality. Her phone had died an hour ago. Daniel had forgotten her charger at the restaurant, where they'd had dinner before he dropped his bomb. So she couldn't call her assistant, couldn't access her company resources, couldn't even order a car service to rescue her from this nightmare. Then she saw them, headlights slowing, pulling onto the shoulder 20 feet ahead, the yellow roof light of a taxi glowing like a beacon through the downpour. Victoria's knees nearly buckled with relief as a man stepped out, middle-aged, wearing a worn leather jacket, his face creased with concern as he jogged toward her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His voice carried genuine worry, not the cautious suspicion she might have expected from a stranger approaching a woman on a dark highway. "What are you doing out here? Are you hurt?" Victoria opened her mouth to answer, but suddenly the weight of everything, the abandonment, the betrayal, the sheer cruelty of being left roadside while pregnant, crashed over her like a wave. Her vision blurred as the world tilted sideways, and the last thing she registered before her legs gave out was the stranger's strong hands catching her, his voice calling, "I've got you, ma'am. You're safe now. I've got you." James Mitchell had been driving taxis for 15 years, but he'd never seen anyone look as broken as the pregnant woman trembling in his back seat, her evening gown clinging to her like a second skin while she clutched a wadded tissue that had long since dissolved into useless fragments. He'd wrapped his emergency blanket around her shoulders and cranked the heat to maximum, but the shivering seemed to come from somewhere deeper than cold, somewhere warmth couldn't reach. "I'm taking you to Memorial Hospital," James said gently, watching her in the rearview mirror as he pulled back onto Highway 95, but Victoria shook her head with surprising vehemence despite her obvious distress. "No hospital, please." Her voice was hoarse from crying, but there was steel underneath the tears that made James reconsider his assumptions about the fragile woman he'd rescued. "I just need to go home. 2847 Vallejo Street in Pacific Heights. Can you take me there?" James recognized the address. It was in one of San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhoods, where homes started at $5 million and climbed rapidly from there. But he'd learned long ago not to judge people by their addresses or circumstances because life had a way of humbling everyone eventually. "That's a long drive from here, ma'am. Are you sure you're okay? You fainted back there. Maybe we should—" "I'm sure." Victoria met his eyes in the mirror, and James saw something there that made him nod and change his route toward the city. "Thank you for stopping. Most people wouldn't have." She paused, seeming to struggle with something, before adding quietly, "My husband left me at that rest stop. He drove away with everything, my phone charger, my overnight bag, even the picture of our ultrasound I'd been showing him at dinner. He chose his first love over us." Her hand moved protectively over her belly, and James felt anger kindle in his chest at the kind of man who could abandon a pregnant woman. "I'm sorry," James said, meaning it deeply, but Victoria just stared out the window at the passing darkness like she was searching for something she'd lost in the night. The drive back to the city took 90 minutes, but they fell into an unexpected conversation that felt more real than most interactions James had with passengers who treated him like mobile furniture. Victoria asked about his life, really asked with genuine interest that surprised him, and James found himself talking about his daughter Emma, who was studying engineering at Berkeley on a partial scholarship that still left them drowning in loans. He mentioned his wife Lisa's medical bills from her cancer treatment 3 years ago, bills they were still paying off despite her being in remission now, and how he drove night shifts to make extra money without sacrificing time with his family during the day. "You're a good man, James Mitchell," Victoria said when he pulled up to her address, a stunning Victorian mansion that made his stomach clench with the reminder of how different their worlds were. But she said it like she knew what goodness meant, like she'd been searching for it and rarely found it. "Most people would have driven past someone like me tonight, but you stopped. You helped. You listened like my problems mattered even though you're dealing with your own struggles." James started to wave off the compliment, uncomfortable with praise for doing what any decent person should do, but Victoria was already pulling something from her evening bag, a business card that looked expensive even in the dim interior light. "This is my attorney's card. Call him tomorrow and tell him I want to discuss a position for you. Not charity, I don't believe in charity, but I believe in surrounding myself with people who have integrity, and you've shown me more of that in 90 minutes than some people have shown in 5 years. "Ma'am, I don't understand," James said, staring at the card that read, "Richard Thornton, Esquire, Corporate Counsel, Hartwell Enterprises," but Victoria was already opening the door, moving with renewed purpose despite her earlier collapse. "You will," she promised, turning back with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but held something harder, something that reminded James of his grandmother's expression when she used to say that God didn't sleep on wickedness. "James, do you believe that people eventually face consequences for their actions? That karma or justice or whatever you want to call it actually exists?" James thought about the question carefully, remembering the drunk driver who'd killed his younger brother walking home from work, remembering how that driver had eventually crashed into a tree and paralyzed himself, and realized he did believe, though he'd never articulated it quite this way before. "Yes, ma'am, I do. Maybe not on our timeline, but eventually, yes." "Good," Victoria said, and now her smile reached her eyes, transforming her tear-stained face into something almost luminous with purpose. "Then you're going to enjoy what happens next. My husband Daniel works at Sterling Corporation, Senior Vice President, very proud of his title and his trajectory toward the executive suite. What he doesn't know is that Sterling is a subsidiary of Hartwell Enterprises, and Hartwell Enterprises belongs to me. I inherited it from my father and built it into what it is today, but I've kept my ownership completely anonymous." She paused, letting that sink in before adding, "Daniel has been working for his wife for 5 years without knowing it, and tonight he abandoned his boss on Highway 95. James felt his mouth fall open as the implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes, each one triggering the next in an accelerating chain of consequences. "Ma'am, are you saying—" "I'm saying that Daniel's mother, Patricia, has been pressuring the board to appoint him as acting CEO, while the mysterious owner remains absent from company operations," Victoria interrupted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She's scheduled an emergency meeting for 3 weeks from now. She plans to install her son in my seat and use the platform to publicly mock the pathetic woman he finally had the courage to leave." Victoria's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite tears anymore. "But what Patricia doesn't know is that the owner is finally ready to make an appearance, and I'm bringing a guest." "A guest?" James repeated, still trying to process everything she'd revealed. But Victoria was already walking up her front steps, moving like a queen returning to her castle after a temporary exile. She turned back one final time, and her expression held promise and warning in equal measure. "Call my attorney tomorrow, James. Tell him you're my new director of operations. You're going to need a suit, a very good suit, because in 3 weeks you're going to walk into that boardroom beside me and watch what happens when a kind taxi driver gets rewarded for his integrity, while a cruel husband faces the consequences of his betrayal." She paused at her door, one hand on the handle, before adding softly, "And James, when you see Daniel's face at that meeting, when you watch him realize who I really am and what he's lost, remember that you helped save me on the night when the man who promised to love me chose to destroy me instead. Remember that kindness matters, because I'm never going to forget it." The door closed behind her with quiet finality, and James sat in his taxi, staring at the business card in his hand, wondering if he'd just imagined the entire conversation or if his life had actually just changed in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. His phone buzzed with another fare request, pulling him back to reality, but as he drove away from that magnificent mansion, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would teach him more about justice, consequence, and the ripple effects of simple human decency than 15 years of night shifts ever had. 3 weeks suddenly seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream for James Mitchell, but every morning he woke up convinced the entire experience had been a hallucination until he looked at his closet and saw the tailored suit hanging there, charcoal gray Italian wool with a price tag that had made his wife Lisa gasp when he'd explained where it came from. Richard Thornton, Victoria's attorney, had called exactly 24 hours after that rainy night, and the conversation had confirmed everything while simultaneously raising 1,000 new questions that James didn't dare ask. "Mrs. Hartwell takes care of people who take care of her," Thornton had said in that crisp attorney voice that made every statement sound like a binding contract. "Your daughter Emma's student loans have been paid in full. Your wife's remaining medical debt has been cleared, and your salary as director of operations will be $400,000 annually, plus benefits and equity options." He'd paused, letting those numbers sink in like stones dropping into still water before adding, "All Mrs. Hartwell asks in return is your loyalty, your discretion, and your presence at a board meeting on April 28th. Can she count on you, Mr. Mitchell?" James had said yes before his brain fully processed what he was agreeing to, but now, standing in the marble lobby of Sterling Corporation's downtown headquarters, his reflection in the polished floor showing a man he barely recognized, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The building screamed wealth and power from every surface. Crystal chandeliers, abstract art that probably cost more than his house, security guards in suits nicer than the one he was wearing. This wasn't his world, and everyone who passed him seemed to know it despite his expensive clothes. "Mr. Mitchell?" A young woman in a severe black dress approached with a tablet in her hands, her smile professional but warm. "I'm Jennifer Chen, Mrs. Hartwell's executive assistant. She's asked me to brief you before the meeting begins." She gestured toward a private elevator, and James followed, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The board consists of 12 members, but only 8 know Mrs. Hartwell's true identity. The other 4, including Daniel Hartwell and his mother Patricia, believe the owner is a reclusive billionaire who inherited the company and prefers to remain anonymous. The elevator climbed silently toward the executive floors, but James's stomach felt like it was still in the lobby. "And today they're going to find out the truth?" "Today they're going to find out many truths," Jennifer corrected, and something in her tone suggested she'd been waiting for this moment as eagerly as Victoria had. "Patricia Hartwell has spent 3 weeks lobbying board members to install her son as acting CEO. She's convinced them that the owner has abandoned the company, that Daniel's leadership is exactly what Sterling needs, and that his recent divorce makes him more focused and available for the demands of the position." Her lips thinned with distaste. "She's also been telling anyone who will listen that Daniel finally freed himself from a gold digger who trapped him with a pregnancy and bled him dry financially." James felt anger surge through him at those words, remembering Victoria's tear-stained face in his rearview mirror, the way she'd trembled with more than just cold. But he worked for her. She gave him everything. She gave him everything, and he threw it away for a woman he dated in high school. Jennifer interrupted, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine fury underneath. Rebecca Chambers, pretty, vapid, and perfectly content to be a trophy wife to a man she thinks is about to become a CEO. They've been planning a summer wedding in the Maldives, using the signing bonus Patricia promised Daniel once his appointment was confirmed. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with portraits of former executives, and Jennifer led him toward a set of imposing double doors. Mrs. Hartwell has been watching everything from a distance, waiting, planning, and now it's time. The conference room beyond those doors was everything James expected, and nothing he was prepared for. A table that could seat 20, windows overlooking the entire city, and 11 people already seated, 10 board members in expensive suits, and 1 woman at the head of the table who made James's breath catch in his throat. Patricia Hartwell was in her early 60s, perfectly coiffed and dripping with jewelry that probably cost more than James's entire lifetime earnings, but her expression held the kind of smug satisfaction that made his hands clench involuntarily. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I appreciate your patience over these past months as we've navigated the owner's absence. My son Daniel has demonstrated exceptional leadership during this transitional period, and I believe—" She stopped mid-sentence as the doors opened again, and James turned to see Victoria Hartwell walk in. She wasn't the broken woman from that rainy night anymore. She'd transformed into something else entirely, something powerful and terrifying in its controlled elegance. Her navy suit was impeccably tailored to accommodate her now 8 months pregnant belly. Her hair was swept into a flawless chignon, and her makeup was perfect except for the slight puffiness around her eyes that suggested she'd cried recently but refused to let it show. She moved with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building but the ground it stood on, and the effect on the room was instantaneous. 8 board members stood immediately, their faces registering recognition and relief, but 4 remained seated in confusion, including Daniel Hartwell, whose face had gone absolutely white as he stared at his abandoned wife walking toward the owner's empty chair at the far end of the table. "Please everyone sit," Victoria said, her voice steady and clear as crystal as she settled into her seat with practiced grace. "I apologize for my extended absence, but I had some personal matters to attend to. Family issues, you might say." Her eyes locked on Daniel, who looked like he was choking on something, before sliding to Patricia with surgical precision. I believe you were discussing my company's leadership structure, Patricia. Please continue. I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts on who should be running Hartwell Enterprises. The silence that followed was so complete that James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. But what struck him most wasn't the shock on Daniel's face or the horror dawning on Patricia's. It was the way Victoria's hand rested protectively on her belly, the way her chin lifted with unshakable dignity, and the way she smiled at the woman who'd called her a gold digger without knowing she was talking about the person who controlled her son's entire future. Actually, Patricia said, recovering with the resilience of someone who'd bulldozed through obstacles her entire life, I think there's been some confusion, Mrs. Hartwell. While I'm sure you've been a supportive wife to my son, this is a board meeting for Sterling Corporation executives. Perhaps you're looking for Daniel. He's right here, though I'm surprised you'd come to his workplace after he abandoned me on Highway 95 3 weeks ago. Victoria interrupted, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire room with its quiet power. After he left his 7 months pregnant wife at a rest stop in the rain so he could run to his high school girlfriend. After he told me his mother was right, that I trapped him, that I was a mistake he was finally correcting. She paused, letting each question land like a physical blow. Is that what you were going to say, Patricia? Patricia's face flushed red, but Daniel looked like he might actually vomit, his eyes darting between his mother and his wife with the desperation of a man watching his entire life collapse. Victoria, I can explain. I'm sure you can, Victoria said, and now her voice carried an edge that made James's spine straighten instinctively. But first, let me explain something to you, Daniel, and to your mother, and to everyone in this room who doesn't already know the truth. She stood slowly, her hands pressed flat against the table, her pregnant belly a visible reminder of everything Daniel had abandoned. My name isn't just Victoria Hartwell, it's Victoria Hartwell, founder and sole owner of Hartwell Enterprises, the parent company of Sterling Corporation, Meridian Manufacturing, Thompson Logistics, and 17 other subsidiaries that employ 43,000 people worldwide. The words fell into the room like grenades, and James watched Daniel's face transform from confusion to comprehension to absolute horror as each piece of information clicked into place. That means, Daniel, Victoria continued, her eyes never leaving her husband's face, that for the past 5 years, you haven't been working your way up someone else's corporate ladder. You've been climbing mine. Every promotion you celebrated, every bonus you spent, every business decision you made, all of it happened because I allowed it, because I signed off on it, because I loved you and wanted to support your dreams. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, but she steadied herself immediately. And 3 weeks ago, you abandoned the woman who'd given you everything, literally everything, for a chance with someone you thought was more worthy of your love. Patricia had gone from red to white, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her pallor, but she rallied with the desperation of someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble. This is absurd. If you owned the company, why would you hide it from your own husband? Why would I want to know if he loved me for myself or for what I could give him? Victoria cut her off with surgical precision. Why would I want to test whether the man I married valued integrity over opportunity, loyalty over advancement, love over ambition? She sat back down, her hand moving to her belly as the baby kicked, a movement James could see from across the room. I got my answer 3 weeks ago when he left me bleeding and alone on a dark highway, when he told me I was a mistake, when he chose someone else while his child moved inside me. The room had gone so quiet that James could hear the city sounds filtering through the windows, car horns, distant sirens, the ambient noise of life continuing while this small world imploded. He wanted to say something, to offer support or comfort, but he understood instinctively that this was Victoria's moment, that she needed to speak these truths without interference. "Now," Victoria said, her composure returning like armor settling back into place, "I believe Patricia was about to propose installing Daniel as acting CEO. I'd like to hear the rest of that proposal before we move to the real business of this meeting." Her smile was cold and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. "Please, Patricia, tell me why your son, the man who abandoned his pregnant wife, who betrayed the woman who'd given him every opportunity, who chose cruelty over character, would make an excellent leader for my company. I'm genuinely curious about your reasoning." Patricia Hartwell had built a reputation on never backing down, but as she stared at the pregnant woman who'd just revealed herself as the power behind everything her son had achieved, even her legendary composure cracked like fine china dropped on marble. "Mrs. Hartwell, Victoria, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Daniel never told me the full circumstances of your separation. If you'd known what?" Victoria's voice cut through the excuse with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, and James watched Patricia flinch despite her attempts to maintain dignity. "If you'd known I was the owner, you wouldn't have spent 3 weeks telling board members I was a gold digger who trapped your son. You wouldn't have called me pathetic. You wouldn't have celebrated that Daniel finally freed himself from the mistake of marrying me." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Patricia's face. "Or are you saying that if you'd known I controlled your son's career, you would have pretended to respect me while still believing all those things?" Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate in a way that made James feel something almost like pity. Almost, but not quite. "Victoria, please. I made a terrible mistake. Rebecca and it was a moment of weakness, of confusion about the past. But when I saw you walk in here, when I realized what I'd thrown away..." He stood, moving toward her end of the table, but Victoria raised one hand and he stopped like he'd hit an invisible wall. "You realized what you'd thrown away," Victoria repeated, and her laugh was bitter and sharp as broken glass. "Not who, Daniel, what? You saw the company, the power, the wealth you'd stupidly abandoned. But 3 weeks ago, when you left me in the rain, you didn't see any of that. You saw a woman you thought had nothing, no resources, no leverage, no ability to affect your future, and you threw her away like garbage." She pressed both hands against the table, leveraging herself to stand despite her advanced pregnancy, and the physical effort made her words somehow more powerful. "That's who you really are, Daniel. That's the man you showed me when you thought there would be no consequences." "I'll make it right," Daniel said, and now tears were streaming down his face in a display of emotion that might have moved James if he hadn't seen Victoria's face that rainy night, hadn't heard the raw devastation in her voice as she'd told him her husband had abandoned her. "Victoria, please. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. You'll resign, effective immediately," Victoria interrupted, her voice hard as steel and twice as sharp. "You'll sign a separation agreement that gives me full custody of our daughter, with supervised visitation only after she turns 5. You'll return every piece of company property, every stock option, every benefit you've received, and you'll do it quietly, without contest, because the alternative is that I release security footage from the rest stop, showing exactly how you abandoned your pregnant wife. Footage that includes audio of you calling me a trap and a mistake." She paused, letting that threat sink in, before adding, "Rebecca Chambers can decide if she still wants to marry a man who's about to be unemployed, publicly disgraced, and paying substantial child support on a taxi driver's salary." James jerked at that last phrase, suddenly understanding why Victoria had insisted he be here, why she'd transformed his life so dramatically in 3 weeks. He wasn't just witnessing justice, he was part of it, the living contrast between the kind taxi driver who'd stopped to help and the cruel husband who'd driven away. "And you," Victoria said, turning her full attention to Patricia, whose face had gone from white to gray as she comprehended the totality of her son's fall. "You're also resigning from the board, effective today. I've tolerated your presence because Daniel asked me to appoint you 3 years ago, and I was trying to be a good wife who supported her husband's family. But you've shown me who you really are, someone who mocks the vulnerable, who celebrates cruelty, who values appearance over character." Her voice softened slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "My daughter will never know a grandmother who taught her son that abandoning his pregnant wife was something to celebrate." Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish drowning in air. "You can't do this. I have connections, lawyers, influence." "You have nothing I didn't give you through your son," Victoria corrected gently, almost kindly, which somehow made the words more devastating. "And now I'm taking it back. Security will escort you both from the building. You have 1 hour to collect your personal items." The silence that followed was broken only by Daniel's choked sobbing, a sound that James found both pathetic and fitting. But Victoria wasn't finished. She turned to face the entire board, her hand once again resting protectively on her belly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged stronger. "Let this be a lesson to everyone in this room," Victoria said, her eyes moving from face to face, ensuring each person felt the full impact of her words. "Character matters. Integrity matters. How you treat people when they have nothing to offer you. That's who you really are." Daniel saw a pregnant woman he thought was powerless, and he chose cruelty. But a taxi driver named James Mitchell saw that same woman and chose kindness. She gestured to James, who felt every eye in the room turn toward him, his face burning with attention. He'd never sought. James stopped when no one else would. He helped without asking for anything in return. He listened to my pain like it mattered, even though he was struggling with his own problems. And that simple act of human decency changed both our lives. Victoria moved around the table with surprising grace for someone so heavily pregnant, stopping beside James's chair and placing one hand on his shoulder. "This is James Mitchell, your new Chief Operating Officer, not Director of Operations. I've decided he's earned a bigger role. He'll be overseeing all subsidiary operations, reporting directly to me, with full authority to make executive decisions." She squeezed James's shoulder gently, and he heard the emotion underlying her professional tone. James has something most people in corporate America have forgotten: the understanding that how we treat people in their darkest moments defines us more than any business success ever will. Daniel made a sound, something between a sob and a protest, but Victoria ignored him completely, her attention focused on James's stunned face. "Your daughter Emma's tuition is covered for her remaining 3 years, plus graduate school if she wants it. Your wife Lisa will receive premium health care for life through our executive medical plan, and your starting salary as COO is $800,000 annually, plus performance bonuses and equity that will vest over 5 years. She smiled at his shocked expression, and this time the smile reached her eyes with genuine warmth. "You saved me, James, not just from the highway, from losing faith in human goodness entirely. This isn't charity. It's recognition that kindness and integrity are the rarest qualities in business, and I want them in my executive leadership." James felt tears burning in his eyes as the enormity of everything crashed over him: the life-changing opportunity, the responsibility, the sheer improbability of a taxi driver becoming a chief operating officer because he'd done what any decent person should do. "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept," Victoria interrupted gently, "and say you'll help me build a company culture where people like you thrive and people like Daniel face consequences." She turned back to the board, her expression hardening once again. This company will value character over credentials, integrity over ambition, and human decency over ruthless advancement. Anyone uncomfortable with that direction should consider whether they want to remain on this board. No one spoke, but 8 heads nodded in understanding while 2 chairs sat empty. Daniel and Patricia had already fled, unable to face the consequences of their cruelty any longer. "Good," Victoria said with finality. "Now let's discuss actual business. James, I'll need your insights on operational efficiency across our manufacturing subsidiaries. I've reviewed your suggestions from our late-night conversations, and I think your ideas about worker retention and quality control are exactly what we need." She settled back into her chair, one hand protectively cradling her pregnant belly, and James saw something in her expression that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, not just strength or determination, but hope. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, but James barely processed the financial reports and strategic discussions because his mind kept returning to that rainy night, to the choice he'd made to stop when no one else would, to the simple act of human kindness that had somehow led him here. He thought about Daniel, who'd had everything and thrown it away because he couldn't see value in what he possessed until it was gone. He thought about Patricia, who'd celebrated cruelty and discovered too late that mockery aimed at the vulnerable could destroy the mocker. And he thought about Victoria, who'd tested her husband's love by hiding her power and learned the devastating truth that he'd loved her position more than her person. As the board members filed out, several stopped to congratulate James with varying degrees of sincerity, but he barely heard them because Victoria had asked him to stay behind, her expression suggesting there was more to discuss. When they were finally alone, she stood and walked to the windows overlooking the city, her silhouette against the afternoon sun reminding James of a general surveying a battlefield after victory. "Do you think I was too harsh?" Victoria asked quietly, not turning around, and James heard the vulnerability underneath the question, the part of her that still loved the man who'd betrayed her, even while knowing that love was built on false foundations. "No," James said honestly, moving to stand beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "I think you were fair, maybe even merciful, considering what he did to you." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her reflection in the glass showing tears she refused to let fall. "My daughter kicks every time I think about that night, like she's reminding me that we survived, that we're strong enough to face whatever comes next." She finally turned to look at James, and her smile was sad but genuine. "You gave me that strength, James, when you stopped, when you helped. You reminded me that good people still exist, that not everyone measures relationships by what they can extract from them." "I just did what was right," James said, uncomfortable with praise for basic human decency, but Victoria shook her head firmly. "No, you did what most people wouldn't. And in a world where kindness is rare, that makes you exceptional." She extended her hand formally, all business once again. "Welcome to Hartwell Enterprises, Mr. Mitchell. I think we're going to do great things together, things that prove success doesn't require sacrificing your humanity." James shook her hand, feeling the weight of promise and opportunity and responsibility settling onto his shoulders, like a mantle he'd never sought but would wear with honor. As he left the building that afternoon, walking past security guards who now nodded respectfully, through a lobby that felt less intimidating than it had that morning, he thought about the journey from taxi driver to chief operating officer, about how one choice on a rainy highway had changed 2 lives forever. Somewhere across the city, Daniel Hartwell was probably explaining to Rebecca Chambers why their Maldives wedding was canceled, why his corner office was empty, why the man she'd thought was ascending to CEO was instead unemployed and disgraced. Somewhere, Patricia Hartwell was probably calling her lawyers and discovering that no amount of connections could undo the consequences of celebrating cruelty. But James wasn't thinking about them anymore. He was thinking about his wife Lisa's face when he told her about the healthcare coverage, about his daughter Emma's reaction when she learned her student loans were paid. He was thinking about the pregnant woman who'd transformed into a powerful executive, about the baby girl who would grow up knowing her mother had faced betrayal with dignity and emerged stronger. And he was thinking about the fundamental truth Victoria had demonstrated so perfectly, that karma wasn't just a concept, it was a force as real as gravity, pulling people toward the consequences of their choices, whether they saw it coming or not. The kind taxi driver had been rewarded. The cruel husband had been left jobless and begging, and justice, for once, had arrived exactly on schedule.